This episode of Now This Is Lit is brought to you by Audible. Check the link in the description to get your first Star Wars audiobook free. Everyone loves free things. Click that link. Do it. This show is also brought to you by our patrons. If you want to support the show in a different way, with just $1 a month, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/StarWarsLitPod. You can get a sticker. You can get access to an exclusive show that we do every month that's wild and chaotic and fun and something you can only get by becoming a member of the Patreon. There'll be so many more perks very, very soon. But for now, do you want a sticker? Do you want a sticker that has a Now This Is Lit logo? Because it's fantastic and I love them. But I also want to give them away because there's just a stack of stickers on my desk. So if you want one, $1 a month. Patreon.com/StarWarsLitPod. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. You're listening to Now This Is Lit, a podcast about Star Wars books, the people who make them, and the readers who just can't get enough of them. I'm your host, Meg Dowell. I use she, her pronouns. At the start of season 3, I talked to James Kahn, who you may know best as the author of the Return of the Jedi novelization. As we were talking about this, he mentioned, almost in passing, that he was working on a memoir that would go into more detail about his writing process for this novelization, among other things. And I filed that away because I knew that if and when this memoir did come out, I'd have to have him back on the show. Well, guess what? His memoir did come out. It's called My Jedi Memoir, A Double Life. And he so graciously agreed to come back onto the show and talk to me about all kinds of things. And I hope, if nothing else, this conversation not only motivates you to read this book that we'll be talking about, but also the Return of the Jedi novelization if you've never read it, plus many of the other projects that he's worked on over the years. It was such an honor to get to talk to James Kahn again, and I hope you enjoy this discussion as much as we did. So we are here. First of all, welcome back. Happy to have you back. We are here to talk about something that you had mentioned briefly the last time that we talked. You'd mentioned that you were working on a memoir, and in the back of my mind, I was like, I'm going to file that away because when that happens, we obviously have to talk about that because you'd mentioned that you were going to go into more detail about writing the your process and all of the things for writing the Return of the Jedi novelization. So I was like, when that happens, you're going to come back. And it happened. And now you're back. And I have it. I have the hardcover.
Oh, wow, great.
Because I can't resist. It's just who I am as a person. And it looks great. They can't see it. I'll post a photo, but it looks great. It feels great. It makes me happy.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm so glad.
So there are so many good things in this amazing book that you've written. Not even just the parts where you talk about Star Wars, but all of it and kind of the way that you weave in not just how you got to writing a Star Wars book, but also kind of weaving in what what led you to wanting to get to that point, what led you to decide that you were going to go into medicine, and then, but you also still want to work in Hollywood and write for TV and do all of these other things. And you kind of, I think one of the things that I loved the most, being the multiple kinds of nerd that I am, is how you kind of, as you were telling the stories of how you, and we'll talk about more about the story of how you ended up writing the Poltergeist novelization and what everything that came after that. But as you're telling these stories, you're also like weaving in stories from when you were a doctor and kind of how you connected that with all of the other things that were happening throughout your life and were kind of leading to all these amazing things that you got to do. So that was great. And and we'll talk about that. But I wanted to start with something that you talked about in one of the chapters. As you were talking about writing Star Wars, you also mentioned how you loved Star Wars when it came out, and you told the story of going to see it on release day in 1977. And I would love if you could talk just a little bit about, for those of us who were not fortunate enough to be there when this happened, if you could kind of like describe what it was like for something like Star Wars to come out in 1977, because as you kind of said in the book, if you weren't there, it's so hard to kind of understand how big of a deal that this was.
It was really a cultural phenomenon.
Yeah.
It came at a time, first you have to remember that the Vietnam War ended in 72. So it was only 5 years after that. And movies, especially, well, both Hollywood and independent movies that were coming out during that period were very depressing and kind of self-flagellating, where often the hero died at the end or had some kind of catastrophe. And they all felt like emotional metaphors to what we had gone through with the Vietnam War and the way that had ended. So there was a sort of a down feeling in the country. The zeitgeist was anti-heroic. Um, so all of a sudden, this film comes out, which sort of in a moment's time ends all that. It's like, okay, enough. Let's get back to something heroic or finding what's good in the good about ourselves and about the universe. So it came out, and within, I don't know, I think within weeks anyway, um, it was a countrywide phenomenon that just blew up everywhere. The studio wasn't sure how to market it at first, so it actually released it in just limited release for the first week or two. And they were so stunned by the response that they went back and opened it up to like 2,000 more theaters. We had been hearing rumors about it. We went opening night to the Chinese Theater in Hollywood. And I had no idea that it was going to be as mobbed as it was. But, getting there even before showtime, the line was around the block. And there was this electric excitement about it. Finally, we got in, and all the seats were taken except the first 2 or 3 rows. So we got a seat in the third row. Um, and I still remember so clearly sitting there and, looking up at the screen practically. And then as the crawl comes away from us, it almost comes from the seat that we're sitting in that recedes into the starscape. And then this gigantic Star Cruiser comes massively out of the top of the frame of the screen over my head. It was just everywhere. You could feel a gasp in the audience. And it was all great after that. And then that it just built. It kept building. So it wasn't like it was just a movie or even just a popular movie. It was, I guess, the closest thing maybe you could compare it to is the Eras tour. But even more than that, because it cut across generational lines. It cut across blue collar, white collar, kids, adults. It was just something about it.
My dad would tell us growing up how he went to see Star Wars when it came out, and then he saw it like 11 or 12 times after that. And I would always ask him, like, why did you just keep going back to see it so many times? And your explanation of what it was like makes so much sense, because he would tell me, like, I'd never seen anything like that before. And to have not had anything like that for so long. And then for that to not only finally come out for so many people to see, but the fact that everyone was talking about it, everyone was experiencing this all at the same time.
Everyone had comments and questions about it. And the other thing is that during that period, there was no such thing as streaming or DVDs or any other way to see the movie except seeing it in the theater and then reading the novelization. So, fans that I've talked to in years since have told me they just read the novelization until the pages were falling out over and over to re-experience what they felt in the movie, and also to go deeper to find out what the people in the movie were thinking and what their relationships were like.
Yeah, and I've always like I've loved that about novelization specifically. Is like I might love a movie, and this is particular to true with Star Wars. But there's so much more depth to it. I mean, movies are great and so are books, but they're so different in the way that they're able to tell different stories, and a book just gives you more of a chance to get to know characters and places and
In a movie, there's so much forward action
yeah.
visually that there's no stopping often. And a book allows the opportunity to pause, uh, the pause that refreshes between these moments of forward motion and to contemplate what's been going on and see what the characters are thinking about it and how they're reacting to each other and what their hopes and fears might.
Yes. So in the book, you talk about how um, because of the way you grew up and your father was a doctor, you always kind of thought of medicine as a form of sorcery, kind of like in the stories that you read when you were young. And you did end up going into emergency medicine. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about how you feel your work as a doctor, working in the emergency room, working in hospitals, has kind of shaped you as a storyteller. Because I love the idea that no matter what our profession is or what we do day to day, depending on like the people we encounter and the experiences that we have, like that can inform not just the stories that we tell, but we can just come up with backstories for anything and everything because of how many different experiences we all have doing different things. So,
Sure. Emergency room was just rife with the stories. It's like every day I would encounter dozens of people and hear their own personal stories and interact with them in some way. And that all got filed away. And I would take sometimes a tiny piece of someone's tale that I had remembered and somehow weave it into a character I was making. And those two areas of my life were constantly feeding each other back and forth. And both of them also spoke to the my very early childhood desires to be a wizard or a sorcerer, and both fantasy writing fulfilled that, and so did emergency medicine. I felt like people were coming in with imminent loss of life or limb, or sometimes actually dead, and I could pull them back, and with my own sorcery of my hands and my alchemy, could make them whole again.
I will say that you just, and I said this already, but there are so many just good stories thrown in to this book in between. You know, you're talking about, oh, I'm about to meet with Steven Spielberg, but also here's this other story that connects, but it's also about just this wild day that I had in the hospital. And
Right.
I think the beautiful thing about that is every time you do this, you're writing so beautifully this connection, this like living metaphor between like this is the experience that I had at just any Tuesday working in the hospital, but also it made me think of this, you know, it inspired me to do this, to kind of shoot my shot and, you know, ask Steven Spielberg if he'll make my book into a movie.
Right. What gall it took to do that, but
I
but
could have
yeah, but
never.
I learned to jump into nerve-wracking situations in the
Yes.
emergency room, and so I took that courage with me to confront Steven Spielberg.
And there's like just I'm like just telling people to read this book, begging almost, because it happens so many times and I really enjoyed it. You know, like I I just did. I wouldn't have asked you to come here if I didn't. Um Another thing I wanted to ask you about, I kind of just for this I wanted to choose like just like more fun questions just because so many
Sure.
things, especially in the beginning, stood out to me. And you're just so fun to talk to, so I figured we could just we could just go for it. So, you also mentioned that something you would often do as a kid is you would read a comic or a story and you would rewrite the endings because you were like, I don't know about that. And you would come up with different potential endings that maybe the story could have had. And you even did this when you were writing the Return of the Jedi novelization, and you ended up giving George Lucas all these suggestions that, of course, he maybe didn't take them, but that's okay.
Yeah, I doubt if he even read them. He was obviously so overwhelmed and busy with his own tasks at that time that for me to think he would read my suggestions about how to make his movie is kind of ridiculous. But I went for it.
You did. Um, Other than that book specifically, I'm very curious. Is there any project that you've worked on at any point, thinking back, that you might still want to change the ending to?
uh, Thinking that I might want to change the ending to. Not that I might want to change the ending, but I always felt like I wanted more out of Goonies.
Mm.
When Goonies ended, it was a great ending, I thought. But then I wanted a sequel or a postscript, or I wanted to know what happened after that. What did the kids do after that adventure was over, and where did that pirate ship end up? And so maybe that's something to happen in the future.
I would love that.
Oh, and there was one ending that I suggested to Spielberg I would like to have seen changed, which was in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which they offered me to do the novelization of that. But I was at that point I was uh, the head writer on a TV show, and I was so busy I couldn't take that on as well. But it always seemed to me uh, that the ending of that should have been that his father, Sean Connery, should have stayed behind and become the guardian of the chalice
Mm.
instead of instead of going off, both of them going off into the sunset together. That was an okay ending, but I was expecting him to stay there because that was his father's life's work and would have been tremendously meaningful to him and meaningful to Indy to know that his father was now eternally the guardian of the chalice. It
Right.
seemed like a great way to change it. And I suggested that, but again, same deal. It was so late in the game that I don't think changing it was in the cards.
It's so fun though. Like I think we all kind of do it. To think about, to watch something or to read something, be like, this ending was great. It's not going to change, but what if?
Right, right, right. And that's how, like you say, I've been doing that since I was 8 or 9 years old. I used to read comic books, amazing stories, and strange tales comic books, and all these horror and fantasy and sci-fi comics. And I love them. But then every once in a while I think, oh, but it would be so cool if this happened instead of that. And then, in my little 9-year-old scrawl, I would write out a new story in my spiral notebook with my changes.
Um, do you remember off the top of your head any of the suggestions that you sent to George
For
about
the
the
end,
ending of Return of the Jedi? I'm trying to
yeah,
remember.
let's see. My feeling after I read the script a couple times was I loved it, but the ending seemed to me to be the same ending
Mm,
as episode 4, as the first movie.
mm.
Is this Death Star, but there's a fatal flaw, weakness, and if you can just fly your planes through the trenches of the Death Star and drop your load into this core tunnel, then it would blow the whole thing up. It seems to me like if that had been how the first Death Star died, you would think the Emperor and Vader would have guarded against that same kind of problem in the second one.
Mm.
So like a story point failure to me. Um, and he did raise the stakes because he had the Emperor on the Death Star this time, so that this time if it exploded, the Emperor would die too. So that part was fine. But I thought it'd be nice if the science part of it were a little different and maybe the stakes raised. So one thought I came up with was, during the Manhattan Project during World War II, when they were first inventing the atomic bomb, there was some fear among the physicists that it could actually set off a nuclear chain reaction in the atmosphere and destroy the entire Earth. So I thought, what if you applied that concept to the Death Star? That this time the Death Star was constructed in such a way that if it was exploded from within, it would set off a chain reaction that destroyed the whole galaxy or the solar system or whatever. But again, by the time I was making these suggestions, it was they were already in editing. They couldn't reshoot new film. I even suggested, though, you could get across something like that with a single line of dialogue, voiceover spoken on the back of someone's head, like the back of Mon Mothma's head as she's talking to someone, telling her fears about. There is this one problem I should mention. I didn't want to tell the starfighters because everyone would get freaked out. So, but again, that didn't go anywhere, and I suspect he didn't even read it.
George, come on. Throughout, you're telling this story of your life and how you went from, um, being a doctor, which is what you'd wanted to do, to kind of finding your way into um, writing and working on these novelizations and working in TV. And you use the hero's journey as kind of like a framework to kind of like guide readers along as you're talking about this. And you start with the inciting incident, which is the story that you told the last time you were here, and you tell it in the book as well, where it just happened that you were working at a hospital that Kathleen Kennedy called to
Right.
ask if anyone knew how to resuscitate an alien. And
That's
if,
how that's how it started. People ask me
yes.
how Hollywood. I say by going to medical school. I went. I was working in an emergency room adjacent to LA in Santa Monica, in Southern California. And this call comes in from a woman who no one, knew who it was. No one had heard that name before, asking if anyone in the ER could help her figure out how to resuscitate an alien. So we said sure, and asked her to come down, and we'd give her a demonstration. So Kathleen Kennedy and Melissa Matheson, who wrote E.T., came down to the ER, and we gave them a demonstration. I played the victim, and one of the other doctors pounded on my chest, and we gave a little CPR demonstration. So they liked it, and they said we should all come down to the set and be the extras in that scene. So 3 or 4 doctors from the ER and 3 or 4 nurses went down to Laird Studios, which was part of MGM at that time, where E.T. was being shot. It was also the old studio where Gone with the Wind was once shot. So it was a sort of classic old Hollywood studio. And we spent the week doing that resuscitation scene. They dressed us all up in hazmat suits, and Stephen told us just you're not going to give us any dialogue. Just do what you would do if someone were brought into a situation where you had to resuscitate them. So we went into our routine and, calling out orders like an amp of epi, an amp of bicarb, shock him, pound on his chest, chest compressions. Um, thinking about it, it's ridiculous to imagine that things that we would do to resuscitate a human would also resuscitate an alien. But at that point, it's less about the exact accuracy of the science than it is about the excitement and forward motion of the drama. So we were all doing that, and you can see me just briefly if you watch the movie again. When an alarm goes off because ET's heart is stopped, 5 doctors run in from stage left, and I'm the 5th doctor holding a clipboard. We're all in our hazmat suits. And then I went and we all surrounded ET and started IV lines and pounded on his chest and things like that. But meanwhile, I had, before this, the previous year, I had written my first science fiction novel, World Enough and Time, published by Del Rey, which is a subsidiary of Ballantine. And I thought, well, this is the only time in my life I'm ever going to be in the same room with Steven Spielberg. If I don't take my shot now, I'm never going to get my shot. So I brought my book, my paperback with me. And at the end of the first day, I cornered him in his office and said, Mr. Spielberg, I'm sure everyone says this to you, but I have this science fiction book. I wonder if I could impose on you to read it and maybe make a movie out of it. So, he very graciously took it and said, well, he put it on his shelf and he's really busy right now, but he would get to it. And I was very proud to have gotten that far, proud to have actually approached him. And then it even gave me like bragging rights with my family that I said, I gave my book to Steven Spielberg. But then the next day, after the first morning of shooting, PA ran up to me and said, Mr. Spielberg wants to see you right away. So I thought, oh, I must have done something wrong. But I went into his office and he said, well, I read a little bit of the book and I liked it. I said, really? You want to make a movie out of it? And he said, no, but he was behind the 8 ball on the Poltergeist novelization. Poltergeist has just wrapped shooting a couple weeks before. They were editing it, and the novelization draft they had was not working. So he said he gave my book to Frank Marshall, who was producing ET, and Frank liked it too. So they decided that if I could promise to have the novelization of Poltergeist done in 1 month, I could have the gig. So, so I thought my first thought was I can't possibly do that. It took me a year to write my science fiction novel, and besides, I'm scheduled for 12 shifts in the ER this month. How am I going to do that? But then I thought, okay, I'll call in every favor I ever had in the ER and get every doctor I know to cover my shifts. And then I spent the next 28 days in Spielberg's conference room on MGM writing Poltergeist longhand in a notebook. And then they hired a secretary to transcribe it on her IBM Selectric typewriter.
Such a good story. It really is just one of those, like, you just happen to be in the right place at the right time, and like every
Exactly.
it's
Exactly. I mean, that's pretty much all of Hollywood about how it works now. Your job says two things. You have to be in the right place at the right time, and then you have to be ready to have both the discipline and the preparation to take advantage of it right in that moment.
Mm.
It's like if I had said, "Well, give me a few weeks to work out my shifts in the hospital," wouldn't have happened. I have to be able to drop everything at the top of the hat and produce what I say I can produce.
Do you think if that hadn't been the case, if you hadn't been where you were at the time that you were, do you think you would have still somehow ended up doing a lot of the things that you've done since then?
Well, I was pretty set in my mind that I wanted to advance a writing career. I just written my first novel, so no matter what else, I was going to continue writing science fiction novels. And I expect, at the very least, by now I would have had a large body of science fiction novels. Um, my hope was I also wanted to write for Hollywood, and I think I could have eventually optioned one of the novels. I was already writing scripts that I got an agent. I was pitching around town, and while the scripts were not selling, they were getting me a lot of meetings because agents like the writing and producers like the writing. So I think eventually that would have continued to grow, and I would have gotten either television work like I did get, or movie work as well as the novels. This just sort of jump started the whole process.
And it's a great story. So it all worked out.
And it's a great story. And another great story, while I was writing Poltergeist, uh, that whole month of November, I had a very poltergeisty experience, which was towards the end of the month. I was writing a scene where there was a storm brewing, and that was in the script as well. But that was the scene I was working on in the novel. And in real life, it had not been stormy at all. It had been a little bit cloudy in Los Angeles and sort of mid upper 50s, and not a real threatening day. But that night, around 8 or 9 o'clock at night, I wrote the words, "Lightning and thunder ripped the sky." It's in the book. I think it's page 293 in the old paperback. And literally seconds after I wrote that, there was the lightning hit the building I was in. It was this in the loudest thunderclap I'd ever heard. I was afraid my eardrums were broken. All the lights in the building went out. Marcy, who was the secretary in the other room, screamed. Something smashed into the table next to me. Uh, I jumped up, and then 10 seconds later, the lights all came on, and the video games, which filled this conference room, all started playing themselves. And I saw that the thing that had crashed next to me was the metal facing of an air conditioner on the other side of the room, which had blown off and flown across the room and almost hit me. Uh, it was a freaky experience. It rattled us both. And that was pouring rain outside. So we said, okay, it's time to leave. We left, and we got outside, and it felt 10 degrees colder. We ran to our car. By the time we got to the car, it was all over. The rain was gone. The temperature was back up to normal. It was either I caused that storm, or I was very in tune, in an extrasensory way with what was happening in the sky.
You say you have such great stories. That's one of the things that makes, like, not only talking to you, but also this book in particular so good. Just the way that you're able to insert them into um whatever you're talking about. And there's so many good ones that I won't spoil because again, I want people to read it. Um I want you to be honest with me when I ask you this next question.
Uh-oh.
So you also mentioned how the first few books that you published, they were great, but the publisher made you change the original titles. Was the title of your memoir the original title that you thought of, or did they make you change that too?
Was the only change, and I kept myself going back and forth with it. It's now titled My Jedi Memoir, A Double Life. But the original title was A Jedi Memoir, My Double Life.
Hmm.
And I couldn't decide which was right. So I just landed on this one finally because I was sick of deciding.
I like it though because it does what it's supposed to do, which is it puts you right at the front of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good, good.
Um, Overall, how was the experience of writing a memoir? You've told some of these stories before, but finally being able to take all of this, and everything the book includes and kind of put it all into one thing that we could all have and read and put on our shelves and admire. What was that like?
Yeah, it's an interesting experience. I resisted writing a memoir for a long time because it felt like braggadocio or like, who cares what my life is about? But my kids kept pestering me to do it because I told them a lot of these stories over the years, and they wanted them recorded, and so they could tell their kids about these stories. So I started thinking of it in those terms, and then once I did, it seemed like really the writing Return of the Jedi was a big focal turning point in my life, and I should make that the focus of the memoir. And then I'd always remembered there's an autobiography by William Goldman, who wrote Princess Bride and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and a lot of great novels and screenplays. He wrote an autobiography called Adventures in the Screen Trade. And part of his autobiography was he reprinted the entire script of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and then wrote afterwards, analyzed it, and wrote all the things he liked about it and he thought was good about it, and things he thought was bad about it, and he would change if he wrote it again. So I thought that would be kind of a cool thing to do with the novelization. So I decided I would, as kind of the centerpiece of the memoir, I would do a scene by scene retelling and analysis of the entire novelization and talk about what was going through my mind when I wrote certain things that I wrote. And like the very first line I remember, first line of the novelization is the very depth of space. It's a sentence fragment. And I wrote it because I wanted to reproduce the feeling that I felt the first time I sat in the third row of the Chinese theater looking at the crawl into this vast space with all these stars and just feeling overwhelmed by the very depth of space. So that was the opening sentence. So I talk about that, about why I wrote that line and how I wrote it. And I do that for sometimes for individual lines, sometimes for scenes, for the entire novelization. Um, and there are also some Easter eggs in there. There are some things I reveal about the script that people don't know about. Should be fun things for Jedi fans to learn about for the first time. Um, there were a couple scenes that I wrote that never made it into the published novelization. For example, I wrote a two-page scene of Princess Leia uh, thinking about the time she was tortured by Darth Vader in Episode 4, when he brought the torture droids in with that needle to do a mind probe. Um, and and she's now processing that and dealing with it and going into detail about what that experience was like. And the editor cut that out of the final novelization, I think, because in retrospect, realizing Darth Vader was her father makes it particularly creepy that he was torturing her like that. So it's not unreasonable to take it out, I guess. But that scene is now, I kept that scene in the memoir because that's the part of the manuscript I wrote.
And it's all really, really, really good and really, really interesting. I'm still working my way through a lot of that, but it's worth it. There's so much detail and being able to really kind of get into what your mindset was and what you were thinking about and why you made certain choices is absolutely fascinating. So I highly recommend, for fans of Return of the Jedi, for fans of the novelization, for fans of your work, anyone really who likes stories and likes knowing more about how they were made. This is a great memoir. I highly enjoyed it, and I highly recommend it. And thank you for writing it. Because I
Thanks for
think,
reading it.
yes, the stories that you tell are just, they're about you, but they teach us things along the way, and they're fun, and a lot of them I think will stick with me for a long time. So yeah, thank you for coming back to talk to me about this book. I'm
Having me.
Yeah, I'm going to continue to talk about it and tell people to read it because it's great, and you put a lot of time and thought and effort into it, and I
I
think
did.
as many people as possible should get to experience it. So thank you so much for all of this.
Could I also ask a
Yes.
favor that anyone who reads it, could you ask all your listeners to write me a review on Amazon?
Yes, do that. I need to remember to do that as well. Yes, reviews.
Doesn't have to be long, just a few kind words and a few stars.
I loved it. 5 stars. There you go. See? Um, this has been great. I'm so glad we got to do this. I know you were in the middle of a move, and that's very stressful, but still got to do it.
That's why there's bare walls behind me. I just finished clearing this room out.
My background can make up for that. It's
Okay.
it's all good. Oh,
All right. Thank you.
yes. Thank you. Now This Is Lit is part of the Faraway Fandom Network. It is produced by Devor Mondam and written, hosted, and edited by me. Jose Jimenez designed our podcast art. You can keep up with the show on Substack and Now This Is Lit, and find the show wherever you get your podcasts. There are so many ways you can support the show, and all of those ways are linked in the show description. The newest way is to become a member of our Patreon. For $1 a month, you can get access to an exclusive show and a sticker. And if we get 500 people to support the Patreon per month, I can hire an editor. That would be great for me, and maybe for you too. So if you'd like to support the show with just $1 a month, you can do it that way. Or you can just keep listening and sharing the episodes. That is also helpful, and I appreciate it. For more book reviews and Star Wars Book Celebration, follow Star Wars Book Reviews on Instagram and TikTok.